Hi, I'm Whitney Espich, the CEO of the MIT Alumni Association, and I hope you enjoy this digital production created for alumni and friends like you.
Steve, thanks for joining us, and we're looking forward to hearing your thoughts about how we can reduce the risks posed by nuclear weapons.
Well, thank you so much for having me. I became engaged in these issues about 40 years ago when I was an undergraduate physics major at MIT. And several of the physics faculty at MIT were concerned about an intensified nuclear arms race. This was in the late 1970s. Several, including Vicky Weisskopf, Phil Morrison, Bernie Feld, Tony French, had been members of the Manhattan Project. Henry Kendall co-founded the Union of Concerned Scientists, and their first major issue was missile defense. The president of MIT at the time, Jerry Wiesner, had been President Kennedy's science advisor, and he was also speaking out on these issues. So it was, an exciting time to be a student with those mentors, and I had the opportunity to have an undergraduate research opportunity program experience with Costa Cippus, and that led me down this path. So let me just bring up some slides. And first begin with a little primer on nuclear weapons. As you probably know, all nuclear weapons use fission reactions, the splitting of atoms, and the most common atoms are uranium-235 and plutonium-239. Now, uranium only has 0.7% of that isotope, uranium-235, that can be fissioned easily. And so to produce high-enriched uranium, the material that is used in a fission explosive, a nuclear weapon, you need to increase that concentration to 90%. And that's done with uranium isotope enrichment. And there are several processes that are used to separate out the isotopes, but the most common now is gas centrifuge technology. And so a lot of the controversy surrounding the programs in North Korea and Iran concern that gas centrifuge technology, because you also need to enrich uranium to produce nuclear fuel for nuclear reactors. And so, restricting access to enrichment technology is a key to restricting the ability of countries to produce nuclear weapons. You can also use plutonium. Plutonium doesn't exist, but it's produced in nuclear reactors, in nuclear fuel, and it has to be chemically separated from the highly radioactive spent fuel, and that's done in a reprocessing plant. And that is also technology that we seek to restrict spread. So the first fission weapons were developed in the Manhattan Project. The first weapon that was used, the weapon that was used on Hiroshima, was a gun-type weapon where you simply assemble a critical mass of high-enriched uranium by firing a HEU bullet into an HEU target. And that requires a lot of material. Little boy contained 64 kilograms of HEU and produced a yield of 15,000 tons of TNT, or 15 kilotons. But the more efficient way to produce a fission weapon is with implosion, using high explosives to squeeze a sphere. In the case of the Fat Man device, today it would be a spherical shell that's more efficient. And you see the Fat Man device used only 6 kilograms of plutonium, but produced 20,000 tons of TNT explosive yield. Most of today's weapons, all of the weapons in the arsenal of the United States, Russia, France, the UK, and China, are thermonuclear weapons. So they use a fission device as a primary. So high explosives squeeze a sphere, a shell of plutonium, usually. And that fission explosion, then the radiation from that explosion is used to compress a physically separate secondary, which has fusion fuel and fission fuel, and the secondary generates most of the yield in the device. And there's really no limit to the yield of thermonuclear weapons. The Soviet Union produced weapons with a yield of 100,000 tons of TNT. I'm sorry, 100 million tons of TNT, 100 megatons. Most of the nuclear weapons deployed today by the US and the Soviet Union have an average yield of about 350,000 tons of TNT. And of course, these are incredible yields. And just to remind you of the devastation that can occur, this is the scene at Hiroshima a few days after the detonation of that 15,000 kiloton weapon that resulted in the deaths of 125,000 people. Fortunately, no nuclear weapons have been used since 1945, since the Hiroshima and Nagasaki detonations. But you can calculate what the effects would be of the detonation of a modern nuclear weapon, of a thermonuclear nuclear weapon. And here is the area that would be totally destroyed by blast and fire if a typical strategic nuclear weapon were detonated above Washington, D.C. You see there would be a huge area of devastation. Roughly about 1 million people would die immediately in the first few days from such a detonation. So the stakes are very high with nuclear weapons because these are such destructive weapons. And it may seem amazing, but at one point, the United States had 30,000 of these nuclear weapons in our arsenal, and Russia had 40,000 nuclear weapons in its arsenal, a total of almost 70,000 combined. Now, this has come down substantially since the end of the Cold War. So some sanity was introduced in the US Russian arsenals, and they're now about 4,000 each. On the other hand, there has been an increase in the number of countries with nuclear weapons, with Israel, India, Pakistan, and now North Korea deploying their own nuclear arsenals. And to show how many of these we have, as I said, the United States and Russia have about 4,000 each. France, China, and the UK have a few hundred. Pakistan and India, and those arsenals, by the way, are not growing except for China. China may be increasing the number of weapons it deploys, but in the other P5 countries, the permanent 5 members of the UN Security Council, those numbers are about stable. Pakistan and India are both producing nuclear weapons. There's more uncertainty with regard to Israel. And of course, in the case of North Korea continues, so far as we know, to produce plutonium and high enriched uranium for nuclear weapons. And so its arsenal is probably increasing slowly. But a total in the world of on the order of 10,000 of these weapons still. So when you think of those images I showed before of the destructive capacity of one nuclear weapon, and then you multiply that by 9 or 10,000, you can see the risk potential for not just the United States, but the entire world. And so President Obama, as a senator, was very concerned about nuclear risks and on them and wanted to focus as a president on reducing those risks. One of the earliest major speeches that he gave was in Prague in April of 2009, and he laid out a blueprint for reducing nuclear risks, and that blueprint had 4 pillars. The first pillar was to reduce the role of nuclear weapons in our overall security and defense strategy, and to urge other countries to do the same. And part of that was negotiating a new treaty to reduce deployed nuclear weapons with Russia, to seek further cuts beyond that, cuts not just in US and Russian arsenals, but all nuclear weapon states, to ratify the Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty. I see the C is missing, it should be CTBT, which treaty that bans the testing of nuclear weapons, and to negotiate a fissile material cutoff treaty a treaty that would ban the production of high enriched uranium and plutonium for weapons. So that was the first pillar. The second pillar was to maintain a safe, secure, and effective U.S. nuclear arsenal to deter any adversary so long as nuclear weapons exist. The third pillar was to strengthen the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, and as part of that, to build a new framework for civil nuclear cooperation, but most importantly, to bring Iran and North Korea back into compliance with the Non-Proliferation Treaty. And then finally, to ensure that terrorists never acquire a nuclear weapon. And the major element in that pillar was an effort to secure all nuclear materials, all HEU and plutonium. So how did we do? And I say we because I did have the great privilege of working in the White House for 5 years, as Aviva mentioned, the first 3 years and the last 2 years of the Obama administration. And during the first 3 years was a time of defining and developing these new policies, and then in the last 2 years trying to make progress on the agenda. So there was a New START treaty with Russia that resulted in a 1/3 reduction in deployed strategic weapons, and that thing. We conducted a nuclear posture review that concluded that changed U.S. policy not to use or threaten to use nuclear weapons against states that are in compliance with their non-proliferation obligations under the NPT. Also, a policy not to develop new nuclear weapons or new nuclear capabilities. There was a review of nuclear employment policy that determined that we could undertake further reductions. And so I think it was in 2013, the president announced that we could reduce nuclear weapons by another 1/3 and invited President Putin and Russia to engage in negotiations toward that end, and also to work for the first time to reduce stockpiles of tactical nuclear weapons and to engage other countries, the other nuclear weapon states, in negotiations to reduce nuclear weapons. On the nuclear material front, there were a series of nuclear security summits, and as a result of pledges that countries made during those summits, 4,000 kilograms of enriched uranium was removed, including all of the HEU being removed from 33 countries. And then finally, excuse me, maybe a crowning achievement for the Obama administration was the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, under which Iran agreed of its program. Of course, now the Trump administration has withdrawn the United States from that agreement, but the agreement still remains in force with the other parties. So Iran remains in compliance. Inspectors from the International Atomic Agency remain at the Iranian facilities, and the UK, France, the European Union, Germany, China, all remain parties to that agreement. But we didn't achieve everything that we hoped to achieve. One of the sort of ironies of achieving a treaty is a treaty requires Senate ratification. 2/3 of senators need to vote in favor for a treaty to enter into force. And part of the deal for that was, with Republican senators, was to modernize the U.S. nuclear force, which I'll talk about in a bit more detail, replacing essentially all of the legs of the triad. And this plan has remained essentially unchanged under President Trump, but as you will see, it's very expensive. In the Obama nuclear posture review, there was a rejection of a proposed policy that the only use of nuclear weapons by the United States was to deter the use of nuclear weapons by others. This is closely related with the idea of no first use, that the United States would only use nuclear weapons in retaliation. It would never use nuclear weapons first. Those were deferred under Obama in the Trump nuclear posture review that was released earlier this year, these goals were explicitly repudiated. There was a failure to begin follow-on negotiations, Russia, nuclear reductions. That failure continues, I'm afraid to say. This has largely been due to Russian concerns about U.S. ballistic missile defenses, which they view as a threat to their deterrent forces. With the degraded relations with Russia, particularly after the Russian invasion of Ukraine or Crimea, and then the imposition of U.S. sanctions, cooperation with Russia on nuclear material security ended in 2014. And of course, with North Korea, there's been a series of failures to constrain the North Korean nuclear program. And despite the statements by the Trump administration, that failure continues. There really are no meaningful constraints on the North Korean nuclear program. So let me talk about just a few of these, really the first three in a bit more detail, although I'd be happy to talk about any of them in questions and answers. So first, with regard to modernization, here is the current Air Force. We have 400 silo-based ICBMs with a 1 warhead each. We have 12 Trident submarines, each that has missiles. Each of those missiles has about 4 warheads. We have 50 B-52 and 20 B-2 bombers that can be equipped with nuclear bombs. We have some dual-capable aircraft in Europe that can carry nuclear bombs. And also we have a large stockpile of reserve warheads that could increase the number of warheads that are deployed on those forces. All of these systems are aging. Here is the proposed modernization plan and the cost about in the order. So we've just begun the program to replace the Trident submarines. And about 1 of these submarines will be replaced every year, beginning in about 2030. The first will be the late 2020s on a trial basis. And that program will cost about $170 billion. There is a program to replace all of the ICBMs called the Ground-Based Strategic Deterrent, and that will cost about $100 billion. And then a program to build about 100 new bombers at a cost of about $130 billion. Those bombers would be dual capable. About $400 billion in all over about a 20-year period, with a peak spending of over $22 billion a year. That's just the modernization cost. That is on top of the normal operation costs, which are projected to be over that period about $900 billion. So that's a total of about $1.3 trillion, which is a lot of money even by Department of Defense standards. The Department of Defense likes to point out that this is less than 10% of the DoD budget. I prefer to say this is more than all the research funding for the federal government, if you exclude NIH. Also, as you can see, the combined budgets of EPA, Treasury, Labor, and Interior. So it's a lot of money, and one way that we could save money and improve strategic stability, I believe, would be to eliminate those silo-based ICBMs, and with it, to eliminate an option to launch those missiles on warning. So the problem is that those missiles are vulnerable to a Russian attack. And because they're vulnerable to a Russian attack, we keep them on continuous alert, ready to fire on warning. When U.S. warning satellite would detect the launch of a Russian missile, we could launch those ICBMs before they would be destroyed by Russian forces. The problem is that requires a quick decision by the president on whether to launch on warning. And Russia is in exactly the same situation. In fact, it's even worse for Russia because they're more reliant on ICBMs. And this does raise the concern about the possibility of a false warning. What if there were a failure in the warning system to believe we were under attack? incorrectly. Also, launch on warning is pointless because our ICBMs are targeted on Russian nuclear forces. But if we were launching on a true warning of attack, Russia would already have launched its forces or would launch them on warning of our counterstrike. So there's really no to having these having these missiles ready to launch on warning of attack. And ICBMs would save somewhere between 100 to 150 billion. So that's one policy proposal that I and others have floated. Another would be to adopt a policy of sole purpose. I'll just say this is related to concern about who has the authority to use nuclear weapons. Right now, the president is the only one with the authority, and no one has, and there is no one with any ability to question his authority to use nuclear weapons for any reason, including first. There are two bills in Congress right now, one by Adam Smith that would adopt a policy of no first use, and one by Congressmen Markey and Liu to require congressional authorization to use nuclear weapons first. And the final issue I wanted to mention was limiting ballistic missile defenses. And although we intend our ballistic missile defenses to defend against Iranian and North Korean missiles, there's a bit of a paradox with missile defense in that it can be both ineffective and counterproductive. Ineffective because the current defenses intercept missile warheads in mid-course, in space. And a defense in space is very vulnerable to countermeasures because in space, everything moves along the same trajectory. A warhead, light balloons, warhead inside balloons all move in the same way. And so it's hard to tell the difference between the warhead and the decoys. But counterproductive because and China worry that its missiles may be vulnerable to our defense. That has caused them to increase or modify their offensive forces. You may have noticed an announcement by President Putin about 2 months ago of new offensive systems, including a new CBM to carry hypersonic glide vehicle or attack the United States by going around the South Pole, a nuclear-powered torpedo and a nuclear-powered cruise missile. All of these things don't make any sense except as counters to US missile defense. And so the question is, can we provide an effective defense against Iran and North Korea without triggering counter reactions by China and Russia? And in the case of Iran, I think first we note that, well, missile threats are really minor if the missiles are not armed with nuclear weapons. And so it is very important to keep Iran in compliance with the JCPOA and not producing nuclear material. Iran has stated that it has no plans to deploy missiles with a range greater than 2,000 kilometers. I think we should take Iran up on that offer and join with Russia to negotiate a verifiable limit on the range of its missiles. If that could be done, there would be no need for the US to deploy long-range defenses against long-range missiles, and no need to trigger these Russian counter reactions. In the case of North Korea, there is a real need to protect not only the United States, but our allies, South Korea and Japan, from North Korean missiles. The current defenses are probably not effective because North Korea can develop countermeasures, but I and some collaborators have been advocating a boost phase defense where we place interceptors on unmanned areas that orbit the coast of North Korea, and those could shoot down in their boost phase. And that system would have no capability against Russia or China. So with that, why don't I stop and take questions if you can?
Yeah, that sounds good. Let me, just before we jump in, let me just remind everyone that if you have questions for Steve, feel free to throw them our way, whether that's via the Q&A feature in Zoom or the comments panel in YouTube Live. And I see Joe has mentioned to people who are curious about the slides and getting back into, if you missed something that Steve had said, that'll be available after the webcast is over. Let me start with just a question from myself. You just ran through a bunch of different ideas for steps that we could take when we think about our nuclear policy in the future. If you could pick just one of those, if you could just make one happen tomorrow, is there one in particular that's sort of near and dear to your heart, or that you think would be, far and away the most effective step that we could take right now?
Well, probably because I've worked on it more than the others. I think eliminating the replacement for the ICBM would be the one I would pick, because it really is the source of instability in our nuclear relationship with Russia. It's also the one thing that would force a president to make a decision very quickly about using nuclear weapons. It is the system that forces this very short timeline, where a president really would literally only have 2 or 3 minutes to make a decision. And all of that is forced by the fact that ICBMs cannot survive an attack. So I think we could improve stability and save money by not replacing the Minuteman ICBM.
Okay. Let me ask a question from one of our attendees here. Wants to know, why does the US rank so low in nuclear weapons security?
Well, I don't know that we rank low in nuclear. Is it the security of our own nuclear weapons, or are the threat that we face from nuclear weapons from other countries?
Well, I guess I'm not sure what this person meant, and they should feel free to throw the next a clarification to the Q&A. But I think the threat of from other countries is definitely something that's coming up in the questions. Someone wants to know if we're vulnerable to a Fukushima-like event, things like that.
Well, it's the very nature of nuclear weapons that, as you saw, even one nuclear weapon is so incredibly destructive that any defense against nuclear weapons would have to be perfect. And a perfect defense is just impossible because nuclear weapons are so destructive. And this is one of the features of the nuclear age, is that we have to live with this vulnerability to nuclear destruction. And the task is to minimize that, to ensure that nuclear weapons are deployed in a way that give no one an incentive to use them.
Okay. Well, that kind of relates to a question I have here from Alfred. Alfred says, it seems that the worry today is not Russia, but dirty bombs and nuclear bombs that do not have to work very well. Countries like Iran do not need a large number of bombs, just enough to make a point. How do you defend against those?
Yeah, this is the terrible thing about nuclear weapons, is that to defend against them effectively, you would need a perfect defense, and that's just not possible. Even if we could defend against missiles, there are other ways of delivering a nuclear weapon. Covert ways that would be difficult or impossible to detect. And that's why it is so important to secure nuclear materials, to prevent absolutely any possibility of high enriched uranium or plutonium becoming available to terrorists, to try to limit the spread of those materials and the technology to improve them. But I do want to say that I personally do not think that the main threat is from terrorists or Iran. I am still very much concerned with the threat from Russia, because it's an enormous arsenal. And although I think the probability of the use of nuclear weapons by Russia is very low, any use of nuclear weapons by the US or Russia would likely escalate and would be catastrophic. And there is the potential for conflict with Russia. I think we saw that potential in Ukraine. There is concern about possible conflict in the Baltic states or on the fringes of NATO. Russia has said that it reserves the right to respond to conflict with nuclear weapons. Russia has adopted a so-called escalate to de-escalate doctrine, where they would use nuclear weapons in a conventional conflict with NATO or the United States to force us to come to our senses and de-escalate. I think those sorts of policies are incredibly dangerous. So I do think it is still worth worrying about the nuclear threat from Russia.
So when we think about those threats and what might happen today or in the next few years, we've had a few questions come in about the Trump administration and what might happen going forward. Someone wants to know, do you expect to see any effective policy improvement from the Trump administration?
Well, one can always hope. I thought at the beginning of the Trump administration that perhaps one of the bright signs would be his desire to improve relations with Russia. And always near the top of the policy agenda with Russia are reductions in nuclear forces and cooperation to reduce other nuclear risks. But President Trump has been constrained in his ability to open up negotiations with Russia due to the investigations of the election interference in the American election. Mm-hmm. And other factors. So there have been recent talks about extending the New START treaty. So I think that there is a possibility of cooperation between US and Russia in reducing these risks.
Okay. A few people want to know too if there's steps that can be taken now to strengthen or improve the NPT. What kinds of things you might want to see there.
Well, basically there were two tracks. One is bringing the countries who are not in compliance, Iran and North Korea, into compliance. And I think the Obama administration made great progress in that regard. I don't think it's has been productive for the US to withdraw from the Iran deal. I think that harms the non-proliferation treaty and regime. I mentioned but didn't cover, or on one of my slides, was a policy of no first use. I think one of the best things we could do to strengthen the non-proliferation treaty would be to declare that the only purpose of US nuclear weapons is to deter or respond to a nuclear attack on the United States or its allies, and pledge not to use nuclear weapons first. After all, the United States is by far the most powerful military power in the world. If we can't defend ourselves against conventional attack without nuclear weapons, then every other country would have an even greater argument for wanting nuclear weapons. Mm-hmm. And what most other countries say they want from the United States and from the other nuclear weapon states are steady reductions in the number of nuclear weapons. So the beginning of negotiations with Russia and the other members of the P5 on reducing nuclear arsenals. That would be the other main step to reinforce the NPT.
Okay. Let me fire another one at you from someone who wants to know, if we could come to acceptable non-proliferation agreements with Iran, North Korea, whoever else we might want to make those agreements with, how do you verify compliance? Is there a sense of the best method to take when trying to do that?
So with Iran, there really is a very elaborate verification system that was outlined in the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, the Iran deal. There are IAEA inspectors at the nuclear facilities that are verifying that no nuclear material is being diverted, that only low enriched uranium that is suitable for reactor fuel is being produced, that no high enriched uranium is produced that could be used for weapons. The concern with Iran is mostly about the possibility of declared some clandestine site. But our best chance for detecting such a facility is to have inspectors on the ground who can take environmental samples, but also who can interact with the scientists and engineers in the Iran nuclear program. And that would be our best chance of detecting any hidden activities. With regard to North Korea, I am less hopeful of reaching an agreement that would end or dismantle their nuclear program. Now that North Korea has nuclear weapons and has in fact tested more sophisticated and high yield nuclear weapons, North Korea successfully tested long-range missiles. I think it will be very difficult to negotiate an end to that program. I think the best that we can hope for in the near term is to freeze the program where it is, to end the production of new plutonium and high enriched uranium, to cap the size of the arsenal, to end testing of nuclear weapons and testing of missiles. To freeze the program where it is would be a positive step, and would then give us time to perhaps negotiate additional restrictions.
So that's interesting. It relates to a question I have here from MMCMA, who notes that one criticism of the JCPOA is that it has a sunset provision, so that the restrictions on Iran's program go away after around 15 years. He wants to know if you have any thoughts on that.
So there's a whole set of restrictions on Iran under the JCPOA, and they have different sunset provisions. But one provision, the main provision, has no sunset, and that is that Iran will never produce high enriched uranium and will never develop nuclear weapons. So there's an indefinite commitment by Iran not to do that. There was a 10-year restriction on the number of centrifuges and the amount of low enriched uranium it could produce. Iran has a nuclear energy program. They have nuclear reactors under construction from Russia. They would like to supply fuel for those reactors, so there is a legitimate civilian purpose. They also have research reactors that they can use, low enriched uranium that they produce to supply the fuel for those reactors. So I think that the challenge is to remain engaged with Iran and to match its uranium enrichment program to its legitimate civilian needs.
Okay. Well, we're coming near the end here. I think we have time for maybe one or two more questions, so I'll just try to throw at least one more major world conflict for you to solve. Matthew Weinberg wants to know, are de-escalation mechanisms in place to prevent an India-Pakistan nuclear exchange? And is this the most worrisome situation in your view?
It is a very worrisome situation, largely because of how India and Pakistan view the threat from each other. So Pakistan apparently believes that because it has nuclear weapons, that India would not dare to initiate a conventional war with Pakistan, particularly one that would where Indian forces would cross the border into Pakistan. And Pakistan has threatened that should that happen, they would use nuclear weapons to defeat an Indian invasion. India, on the other hand, has said that any use of nuclear weapons by Pakistan would lead to an all-out retaliation by India against Pakistan. So I think that is the seeds for miscalculation, that because Pakistan may believe that it can do, with impunity, interfere in Kashmir, undertake other military operations against India. India might miscalculate and retaliate against Pakistan conventionally, and that might trigger a small Pakistan nuclear response, which may trigger a massive or large Indian nuclear response. So I do think that there is a serious basis for concern. Now, can we de-escalate that? I think if there were the prospect for any conventional war between India or Pakistan, the United States, other countries would be very concerned about that. And I hope we would try to intervene to help de-escalate.
Okay, well, I think that takes us right to 12:45. So on behalf of the Alumni Association, I want to thank everyone for tuning into this faculty forum online. And of course, Steve, thank you so much again for sharing your expertise with us today.
Thank you.
For anyone who had a question that we didn't get to, Alumni office staff are going to forward all those questions to Steve if they weren't addressed on air. If you want to tweet about today's chat, you can use the hashtag MIT Better World. And if you have follow-up questions or feedback, feel free to email alumnilearn@mit.edu. So that's alumnilearn@mit.edu. So thanks again, everyone, for watching.
Thanks for joining us. And for more information on how to connect with the MIT Alumni Association, please visit our website.